If I were to tell you these photos were taken during World War II, you might assume that they were from Germany or Poland, but they are not. These photos were taken in the United States, one of 10 internment camps where all people of Japanese ancestry were rounded up from their homes and communities and forced to live during World War II. Each camp held 10 to 15,000 people. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and armed soldiers who had orders to kill if anyone tried to escape. And unfortunately, some people died at the fence. These American citizens lost everything: their jobs, their homes, their constitutionally guaranteed rights. This is one of the darkest chapters of our American story, a chapter that many of us would like to forget or ignore. But we must remember, any society is capable of falling into deep prejudice and unwarranted hatred toward a group of their own. All it takes is a little fear mixed with a dose of deliberate misinformation. Fortunately, today we want to live in a society that respects the rights and dignity of all. But in order for us to raise the bar, we need to more deeply understand the failures of our past. Yes, part of us would rather ignore these embarrassing times, but then we're destined to simply repeat those same mistakes over and over again. Instead, let's face our mistakes and learn from them. I invite you to listen to Bill Uyeda's story. He is an American citizen, and he was rounded up with his family and forced to live in an internment camp. And Bill rose above that tragic time. He joined the U.S. Army, became a physicist from MIT, and then had a very successful career. Listen to his story, more than once if you need to. But when you're done, be able to pinpoint at least 2 times when we, as a society, could have responded to our fellow citizens with more respect. Our future is in our hands. Let's work together so that when we put our hand over our heart and look up at our flag, we can say with deep meaning, "One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." And now, here's Bill's story. Ascent from Adversity.
It happened in these United States, the international cradle of freedom. American citizens of Japanese ancestry and their parents were incarcerated in concentration camps during World War II. Concurrently, they served in the U.S. Army to prove their loyalty to the country of their birth. Actually, those were trying times for Japanese Americans. Memories of those years I could hold a grudge, but I don't. Actually, I've enjoyed a tremendous life in the greatest nation in the world, far beyond my expectations and much better than I deserved. First, before I go any further, let me teach you a couple of Japanese language words. Ichi stands for 1. Ni stands for 2. And san stands for 3. You hook that up with a syllable for generation or times of life. Ich-sei, that's a contraction from ichi-sei. Issei, nisei, and sansei. Issei were immigrants from Japan. Nisei were born in the United States, were citizens of America. The story of the Nisei starts with a dubious beginning for the Japanese immigrants from Japan. They initially arrived in the U.S. in 1869. There totaled 2,000 by 1890. 1,000 per year arrived by 1900, including women. Some were recruited by U.S. business and entrepreneurs in Japan to work our farms and to build our infrastructure. They faced formidable challenges, and their destiny was in grave doubt for over half a century. Unlike European immigrants, they were denied naturalized citizenship. They could not own property, and they were excluded from unions because they were considered inferior and socially inept. In 1907, the U.S. government forced Japan to a gentleman's agreement to no longer issue passports for common laborers. By 1920, 100,000 Japanese were living in the U.S. 25% of them were American-born citizens. 20,000 had already returned to Japan because they saw no reason for staying in a land that did not want them. It boggles the mind that the rest opted to stay permanently in America. They were willing to take demeaning treatment. They were choosing economic deprivation and were willing to endure backbreaking toil. The end that they had envisioned for themselves when they immigrated to the United States. They were hoping against hope that their American-born offsprings would have a better life here. It was a crapshoot at best, and the odds of realizing those hopes was extremely long. But they did it all for the sake of their children. Kodomo no tame, for the children's sake. They raised their families on truck farms and in Japan towns. They showed a display of stoic discipline, unbounded parental care, and devoted filial piety. They taught their children never to bring dishonor to the family name. They were taught to obey law and authority, and they were told to be patriotic Americans and to do well in school. They brought up their children on truck gardens. They were produce brokers. They were landscapers and chick sexers. They were houseboys and domestic servants. They ran shops, hotels, restaurants, barbershops. They hired on with railroads, sawmills, and fish canneries. They published bilingual newspapers, and some isolated cases Nisei college graduates set up professional practices in law, medicine, and dentistry. Most, however, were unable to find jobs. There was a reason for this. The anti-Japanese sentiment that existed up and down the Pacific coast, because of the strained diplomatic relationship between U.S. and Japan, no one would hire them, certainly not in the defense industries, and mostly during the Great Depression when jobs were scarce. Most ended up on the family truck farms, hoping against hope that things would work out in the end. They had to adopt a posture of gaman and gambare, endure and hang tough. They also held austere Buddhist philosophies which indicated giri and on, duty and responsibility, and shimbo shite seiko suru, out of adversity grows success. Their Caucasian neighbors saw them as extremely responsible and very good at their crafts, but organized labor considered them as an economic threat. Urged on by labor, the Immigration Act of 1924 slammed the door shut on any further admission for those ineligible to become citizens. That law was revoked in 1952 by the McCarran-Walters Act, which opened immigration from Japan and allowed those immigrants to become naturalized citizens. December 7th, 1941, a day that Roosevelt called a day that will live in his infamy in history. Everybody's lives in America were changed instantly. But no one was more affected than the Nisei and their Issei parents from Japan. The Issei, who were ineligible for citizenship, were immediately enemy aliens. The Nisei were non-aliens. The Issei leadership was that very day rounded up by the FBI, who had them under surveillance for years because of the strained diplomatic relationship between Japan and the United States. Their funds were frozen. They were summarily discharged from their jobs. The Nisei were declared non-aliens, not an alien, but a questionable citizen. My life came to a screeching halt when on December 8th I was barred from boarding a public transit bus by which I had been commuting to the University of Washington. I was immediately embarrassed and ashamed. I was at once afraid and angry. But most of all, I was disillusioned because for 18 years I had been taught to be a patriotic American. The outbreak of hostilities began two paradoxical experiences for the Japanese Americans. First, they would be interned behind barbed wires to be, along with their parents, the internment camps were patrolled by military police on foot and from conning towers. Second, thousands of Japanese Americans would serve in the United States Army in both Europe and the Pacific Theater of Operations. I would end up as an infantry officer assigned to intelligence duties. But first, authorities had to decide what to do about my selective service classification. My 1A draft classification, which had been downgraded to non-alien, had to be restored before I could be drafted. More about that later. On February 19th, 1942, just a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which authorized the evacuation of all Japanese from the Western Defense Command. Signs that were posted all over in every conceivable public place, instructing heads of every Japanese household to register their families for evacuation. These people are registering their families. The civilian exclusion order was issued by the Western Defense Command in the name of national security. However, there's not a single incident of sabotage or espionage committed by anyone of Japanese ancestry. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, it was angry temper was flaring in the public against all Japanese, whether citizens or aliens alike. The print media issued inflammatory headlines up and down the Pacific coast. It was the in thing for the newspaper companies to take an attack upon those dirty Japs. In fact, one headline announced, quoting one public official as saying, "The only good Jap is a dead Jap." It mattered not that the Japanese community in the United States had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. Nor did it matter that a large percentage of the Japanese community were U.S. citizens. The only thing that mattered was that they looked a lot like the enemy. Within months after the beginning of the war, in March of 1942, the first of the evacuees reported to their designated railroad sidings or bus depots to be transported to some undisclosed destination. They were wearing their best suits. They were carrying only what they could tote. And they had ID labels on every individual that reported there. The interesting thing is that amongst the evacuees were veterans of former U.S. wars. One was a 72-year-old wounded veteran from the Spanish-American War. It's remarkable that the entire operation went off without a hitch. Armed soldiers supervised the operation, but no one was forced to board trains or buses. Actually, however, in the end, their peaceful compliance, orderly compliance with the evacuation stood the Japanese community in good stead when the government later revoked laws which had kept them from becoming immigrants and becoming citizens of the United States. Not everybody went to their designated internment camps directly. First, they went to assembly centers. The government confiscated all sorts of available public grounds in the neighborhood. State fairgrounds, racetracks, horse racetracks, immigration processing centers like Terminal Island in San Francisco, and places like that. In fact, some of the assembly centers, some of the evacuees were quartered in assembly centers, possibly occupied by Seabiscuit, War Admiral, or man of war. An ironic story is told about a parent who explained to their complaining children that, you know, good things grow in manure. It wasn't long before everybody was transferred to their permanent sites. I was sent from a community called Bellevue, Washington, to Pinedale, California Assembly Center near Fresno. From there, I was shipped to Northern California in a town called Tula Lake, halfway between Klamath Falls, Oregon, and Reno, Nevada. They came by various means. These people are reporting to the Tanforan Assembly Center, which was a racetrack. Those are some stalls that some horses were kept in. And that's a small, you might call an apartment that those folks were occupying. There were 10 internment camps in 7 different stations. 2 of them were as far east as Arkansas, and 2 as far south as Arizona. They were located in desolate desert terrain. There were watchtowers, there were mountains in the background. Every relocation center was called by different names depending upon where they were located and who was referring to them. They were called relocation centers, internment camps, or concentration camps. But whatever they were called, they were concentration camps because it was where people were detained not because of any crime they had committed, but because of who they were. Each place could handle 10 to 15,000 people. There were the multi-unit barracks housing 5 families. Each had an entry doorway and 4 top-hinged windows. They were heated by potbelly stoves centered in the middle of a 20 by 20 room. The room was lit by a bulb from a dropline cord. Every evacuee was issued a folding army-type cot, and every one was issued a blanket, an army blanket. You could make a mattress by stuffing a large bolster bag with straw. If the amazing part of it is that some of the units displayed little fringed blue star and gold star flags, denoting that some member of that household was on active duty in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, or that they were battlefield casualties. One corner unit in a block of 12 was the designated communal mess hall. Meals prepared by evacuee cooks were long on quantity, but hardly gourmet. Sandwiched between the barracks were communal bath, shower, toilet, and laundry facilities. Privacy, the personal habits were exercised in less than private surroundings. The evacuation was an unmitigated disaster for all Japanese. For the Issei, they had lost their complete sense of achievement because everything that they had worked for in decades before the war, they had to leave behind. The Nisei faced an uncertain future because the nation of their citizenship was at war with the nation of their parents. Their name was maligned, even though they had signed an oath of allegiance to the United States as part of the evacuation process. But they endured the ordeal with shikata ga nai. Nothing can be done about that now. They made the best of their situations. They were marrying, giving birth, and there were funerals for older people whose headstones are about the only thing that remains at most of these evacuation centers. This was an extremely large funeral where one of the evacuees was shot by an MP because he was declared to be too close to the fence. There was education, K through 12. Teachers were Caucasian civil service servants and other accredited internees. There was graduation ceremonies, students walking to school, the Tula Lake Internment Camp High School, kindergarten, elementary school, I'm not certain, but I believe this was a class that I taught. Graduation exercise, a graduate receiving her diploma. Then there was employment. No one had to work, but if you worked, you were paid $12 a month. If you were a professional, you were paid $16 a month. There were jobs for everybody who wanted to work. There were work on camp operated potato and sugar beet factories. There were clerical work. Some of you may remember an old Remington typewriter. There were people who were editing campsite newspapers. There was postal clerk work. In fact, on the left-hand edge you will see a sign that says, "Buy war bonds here." There were firefighters. There were people who were manufacturing camouflage netting for the U.S. Army. There was entertainment of all sorts. There were board games. There were photography. There were crafts for the older ladies. There was Santa Claus here. He even showed up every year. There was scouting for both boys and girls. There was orchestras, bands, and choruses for the musically capable. Those are the Japanese Beatles. There was sports and exercise. What you might notice here is that in this softball game, in the far right edge is a GI visiting the camp and umpiring in the game. There was baseball. There was touch football. There was volleyball. For the elderly, there was organized calisthenics in the snow. There was church service, USO centers, and socials. I think this is probably a Catholic church. I see a couple of nuns. Easter sunrise service, and every site had a USO center where internees could entertain visiting service men on leave. Activities groups organized all kinds of socials, dances, and I can still hear, "Pardon me, boy, is that the Chattanooga choo-choo?" There were health care provided by internee-staffed hospitals, registered nurses, physicians, surgeons, and dentists. In the end, you could choose to relocate. That is, to be located outside of the internment camp, away from the Western Defense Command. Once you chose a viable venture, agreed to by both you and the internment camp, And once you cleared the background check, War Relocation Authority would issue you travel papers and tickets to your new destination. For a college student, university was an obvious goal. For most, employment was an end if they could be hooked up with an employer who was willing to hire you. Remember, this was the wartime, and lots of people were looking for workers in the eastern areas. The third option was the military. We'll go into that later. But for most, relocation was a gut-wrenching decision. They had just recently gone through the traumatic experience of relocation. Second, they had some reservations about relocating to an unfamiliar and possibly a hostile destination. Thirdly, there was the issue of long-term or even permanent separation from the family. Relocation was not for everyone. At the end of the war, thousands of people were still in the internment camps. But for me, relocation was not an option. I was not going to languish in an internment camp for the duration of the war. As soon as I could, I applied for and was accepted at a college in Chicago. As soon as I got there and found my permanent residence, I could be now an official sponsor for my family who joined me. But what do you know? The Selective Service found me there. And my 1A service classification was restored. I reported for duty at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. I was transferred to Camp Landing, Florida, where replacements for the all-Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team was already battling in North Africa. Before that unit shipped off overseas, I was transferred to the Military Intelligence Language School in Fort Snelling, Minnesota. From there, I guess the Army didn't know what to do with me. They sent me to Fort Benning in Georgia to the Infantry Officer Candidate School. From there, I was assigned to the Civil Intelligence Service of General Headquarters of Allied Forces, Western Pacific. In the end, I ended up in the occupation of Japan. 6,000, while 100,000 people, 70% of whom were U.S. citizens, were languishing in internment camps. Thousands of Nisei GIs were serving in the war effort. 6,000 were serving in classified campaigns. Their intelligence linguists, strategic specialists, tactical assignments, and their training and mission was a military secret for decades after the war. Some people called them the Yankee Samurai. They received considerable command commendations by General MacArthur and General Willoughby, MacArthur's Chief of Intelligence. The mission in the Pacific was not easy for the Nisei. sometimes they went out on forward scouting missions. They had to be accompanied by non-commissioned officers or officers, because on the way back, our MPs, forward guards of our units, would shoot first and ask questions. After all, they look like the enemy. That's a Purple Heart from the Pacific Theater. I would be remiss if I didn't mention at this time hundreds of Nisei women served in the Women's Army Corps in different assignments as linguists, clerks, and medical shop. In addition, there was a Nisei bombardier who, after completing 30 missions in Europe, asked to be assigned to the Pacific Theater, and he helped destroy the Japanese infrastructure. They came from plantations and pineapple and sugar plantations in Hawaii and truck farms in the Pacific Coast. They were business owners. They were intelligent, educated in U.S., some in Japan. They were physically small, weighing possibly 125 to 130 pounds, soaking wet. They had volunteered and were drafted from the internment camps. In fact, one of the volunteers from an internment camp was a battlefield casualty, even though his home had been torched by arsonists, racist arsonists in California. The chaplain who discovered a newspaper article referring to this incident said that there was not a medal high enough in this country to be conferred upon this veteran GI who was lying in front of him. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was formed as an all-Japanese unit due to a petition by the Japanese American Citizens League, who felt that it was imperative for them to see combat duty if they expected to share in post-war America. They remembered Haji. Don't bring dishonor to your family. When you go off to war, fight for your country. Return if you can, but die if you must. 4,000 initial troops, followed by 13,000 replacements, infantry, artillery, and medical people, fighting under the unit logo, Go for Broke. They became the most decorated unit in the United States military history. In 7 campaigns, 223 days of combat, 2 beach landings, they also penetrated the GOTHIC line, the Nazi line stretched across the cliffs south of the Po River Valley. They also rescued the Texas Lost Battalion. In 223 days of combat, they garnered 18,000 battlefield citations, including Congressional Medals of Honor, Medals of Freedom, Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and 9,000 Purple Hearts. One event, the Allied forces had been stymied by the Nazis atop a cliff line across central Italy, the commanding officer directed the 442nd to perform a diversionary action and gave them 3 weeks to do that. Well, that order, within 24 hours, became a direct assault upon a near vertical cliff, which they climbed at night and surprised the Nazis in the morning, had them running north, which became the beginning of the end of the Nazi occupation of Italy. The 442nd was also involved in the rescue of the Texas Lost Battalion in the Bruyere forces in France, forests in France. This operation has been designated in the annals of U.S. history as being one of the most successful, formidable achievements by a military unit in the American Army. To rescue 208 Texas Battalion soldiers, the 442nd suffered 800 casualties. That's the 100th Infantry Battalion, the main component of 442nd Regiment. When the unit returned, an aide to President Truman said, "It's raining, sir. Let's cancel the whole thing." President Truman said, "What these boys have gone through, I can stand a little rain." For all of their achievements, the Nisei soldiers don't talk much about what happened, nor do they much less brag about it. But the consequences of their sacrifices are marked by white crosses in military cemeteries throughout the world. 54 are buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Reports from the battlefield about the valor and sacrifice of the Nisei soldiers convinced this nation more than anything else could, or nothing else could, of their patriotism and their loyalty to this country. It further augmented decades of Issei effort. These events improved the Nisei status in this country from being a despised and discriminated minority to near complete acceptance as Americans. I have been heir to that legacy. I was able to attend MIT on the GI Bill. I was assigned to manage engineering departments for a major United States company, something that I never thought even possible before World War II. In this community, where I have lived for over 60 years, I have been elected to chair church boards, scouting committees, school committees, and many others. Once I was even asked to run for public office, which I declined. Not only I, but my children have benefited from these achievements. A meritorious military service by the Japanese American GIs and the orderly compliance with evacuation finally ended up in a grateful nation, revoking statutes which had denied immigration from Japan and granting naturalization to immigrants. My father died as an American. In 1946, Truman, in a special White House celebration honoring the members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit, made this comment: "I cannot thank you how much I appreciate the opportunity you've given me to thank you for what you have done for this country. You not only fought the enemy, but you have fought prejudice and won. You have made the Constitution stand for what it is: welfare of all people at all times. Keep up the fight." A bipartisan, mind you, a bipartisan congressional committee concluded that the wartime incarceration was a grave injustice brought on by race prejudice, wartime hysteria, and misguided political leadership. Almost 40 years after the conclusion of the war, the Japanese American members of Congress led the fight for redress, and the United States government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1983, or House Bill 442, in which the nation officially apologized for the Nisei's wartime internment. Over 50 years after the war, in a belated ceremony recognizing 20 additional Congressional Medal of Honor designees, President Clinton observed that never has a nation been so well treated by those who were so ill treated. In the face of painful prejudice, they defined America at its very best. As recently as November of 2011, the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian award, was conferred upon 3 military units composed almost entirely of Niseis. They were the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the 100th Infantry Battalion, and the Military Intelligence Service. It took a long time coming, but come it did. After decades of blood, sweat, and tear. What was shed was real American blood. What flowed off of foreheads and backs was honest sweat from back-breaking labor. And what trickled down the cheeks was tears of bitter disappointment under the worst of conditions and against overwhelming odds. The Nisei persevered and prevailed. Patiently, they endured internment. Courageously, they proved their patriotism in combat. They went for broke. They, along with thousands of other patriots, sacrificed to advance the legacy of liberty set forth by our founding fathers centuries ago. It's been their ascent from adversity. Thank you very much.